Look at a clock, any clock, the one on your wall, your phone, your wrist, the one in the corner of your screen right now. Watch the hands move. They go right. They always go right, left to right, top to bottom, around and around in the direction we call clockwise. Every clock you have ever seen in your entire life has moved in exactly the same direction. Now here is the question that nobody asks. Why? Not why in the way your primary school teacher answered it, because that's just how clocks work. Why specifically? Who decided this direction? When they decided it? And what it tells you about who was in charge of the world when that decision was made. Because clockwise is not natural. It is not universal. It is not dictated by physics or mathematics or any property of time itself. Time has no direction. The universe does not move clockwise. Clockwise exists because of where one group of people happened to live, and because of a decision they made, completely without consulting half the world, that every human being alive today still follows every time they check the time. If history had unfolded differently, if one civilization had risen to power in a different hemisphere, every clock on Earth would run the other way. And everything that depends on clockwise, screws, steering wheels, door handles, the way we read graphs, the way we describe direction, the way we think about time itself, would be reversed. All of it, changed by geography, by accident, by the position of the sun over one particular patch of Earth 3,500 years ago. The story of clockwise begins not with a clock, but with a stick. Around 1500 BC, 3,500 years ago, the Egyptians developed one of the earliest reliable timekeeping devices in human history. Not a mechanical instrument, not a digital system, a stick, planted vertically in the ground, and the shadow it cast. As the sun moved across the sky, the shadow moved across the earth. The length and position of that shadow told you where you were in the day. This was the gnomon, the ancestor of every clock ever made. And from this simple instrument came one of the most consequential accidents in human history. In the Northern Hemisphere, where Egypt sits, where Greece sat, where Rome sat, where medieval Europe sat, the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. It travels through the southern sky. And from the perspective of a person standing north of the gnomon and looking south toward it, the shadow sweeps from left to right across the ground. Left to right, the direction we now call clockwise. Around 3,500 years ago, the Egyptians invented primitive clocks known as shadow clocks. In the Northern Hemisphere, the sun moves across the sky from east to west, causing a shadow to move in what we now recognize as the clockwise direction. This solar trajectory naturally became the model for subsequent timekeeping devices: ancient Egyptian sundials, Greek sundials, Roman sundials, all of them in the Northern Hemisphere, all of them producing a shadow that swept left to right, all of them encoding that direction into the human understanding of what time moving forward looked like. For thousands of years, before a single mechanical clock existed, the entire civilized world had been trained to read time moving in this direction. It was not a choice, it was an observation. The shadow went right. Time went right. Then came the mechanical clock. By the 13th and 14th centuries, large mechanical clocks were appearing in churches and town squares across Europe. When early European clockmakers began building mechanical clocks, they chose to replicate the familiar motion of the sundial shadow. That choice fixed the direction that became known as clockwise. The clockmakers were not making a philosophical decision. They were not declaring that right was better than left. They were simply doing what humans have always done when building something new, copying what was already familiar. The sundial went right, therefore the clock went right. One observation, one imitation. 700 years of global standardization. But here is the detail that changes everything. Not every clock went right. One famous example still exists today. the astronomical clock on the old town hall in Prague. Its hands run counterclockwise, following the right-to-left direction of Hebrew script and echoing older local traditions. This unique timepiece shows how easily the convention could have developed differently. The Prague astronomical clock, built in 1410, one of the oldest functioning clocks in the world, has hands that run in the opposite direction to every clock you have ever checked the time on. In Prague's old town square, tourists gather every hour to watch the apostles emerge from their windows and the hands of the clock sweep left instead of right. Counterclockwise. The other way. The way that feels wrong to every person who looks at it. Because every person who looks at it has been trained since childhood, that time goes the other way. The Prague clock is not broken. It is not a curiosity or an error. It is proof that the direction of clockwise was never inevitable, never universal, never written into the laws of physics. It was a choice that Prague for a while did not make. And then eventually, because the rest of Europe had standardized in the other direction, because global trade demanded consistency, because every other clock someone encountered ran the other way, Prague conformed too. The old clock remains as a monument to a road not taken. But no new clock in Prague runs counterclockwise, the standard one. Not because it was correct, because it was early. Now here is the question that the Prague clock opens up. If clockwise was a choice, not a law, not a physical necessity, just a choice made by Northern Hemisphere clockmakers copying Northern Hemisphere sundials, what would have happened if the choice had been made somewhere else? The Southern Hemisphere and the world that never was stand in Australia, or South Africa, or Argentina, or Brazil. Plant a stick in the ground. Watch the shadow. In the Southern Hemisphere, where the sun follows a similar path but appears in the northern sky, a sundial's shadow moves counterclockwise. Had early clockmakers been Australian or South American, today's clocks might very well turn backward. The shadow goes left. Not right. Counterclockwise, because the sun from the Southern Hemisphere does not arc through the southern sky. It arcs through the northern sky. The geometry reverses. The shadow reverses. If the great clock-making civilizations of the ancient world had been located south of the equator, if the Egyptians had settled in what is now South Africa, if the Greeks had built their city-states in what is now Argentina, the shadow on their sundials would have gone left, and the mechanical clocks built to copy those sundials would have gone left, and the entire world would call that direction clockwise, and the direction we currently call clockwise, the direction your clock is running right now, would feel as wrong and backward and broken as the Prague clock feels to you today. Every clock on Earth running the other direction, every screw threaded the other way, because the direction screws tighten was standardized to match the direction clock hands move. Every steering wheel calibrated for a different instinct. Every graph reading from right to left. The entire spatial vocabulary of the modern world, left and right, forward and backward, the way we describe direction and rotation and progress, built on a shadow cast in the opposite direction. All of it changed by the latitude of one civilization. The convention has long since detached from its astronomical origin and become a self-sustaining cultural norm maintained by manufacturing inertia, global trade, and the simple fact that everyone already agrees on it. The story of clockwise motion is ultimately a story about how early technological choices, once embedded in infrastructure and habit, become almost impossible to reverse. The conspiracy, who standardized time and why. Here is where the story moves from interesting to genuinely disturbing. Clockwise standardized naturally in medieval Europe, but the global standardization of time, the imposition of that Northern Hemisphere convention on every country, every culture, every civilization in the world, that was not natural at all. That was deliberate. In 1884, representatives from 25 nations gathered in Washington, D.C. for the International Meridian Conference. Their purpose was to establish a single prime meridian, a zero line for longitude from which all time zones across the world would be calculated. They chose Greenwich, a suburb of London, not because Greenwich was geographically central, not because it was scientifically superior, because Britain had the most powerful navy in the world, the most extensive telegraph network, and the largest empire in human history. 72% of the world's commerce was already being conducted using charts based on the Greenwich meridian. The decision was not scientific, it was political. It was a formalization of an existing power structure. The sun did not rise and set over Greenwich. It rose and set over a planet. But the planet would tell time from London. And with that decision, the clockwise convention of Northern European sundials became the official direction of time for the entire world. Every country that adopted the Greenwich time system, and eventually every country did, adopted along with it the entire spatial vocabulary of the Northern Hemisphere. The direction of time, the direction of clocks, the direction of progress. Half the world's sundials had pointed the other way. None of them were consulted. What clockwise controls? The final part of this story is the part that makes you look differently at ordinary things. Because clockwise did not stay in clocks. Once the direction of time was established, it propagated through every system that needed a direction. Screws. Almost all standard screws tighten clockwise and loosen counterclockwise, specifically because this mirrors the direction of a clock. Righty-tighty, lefty-loosey. The rhyme exists because the screw follows the clock. Steering wheels. The standardized direction of steering, turn right, wheel goes clockwise, is connected to the same convention. Drains. The popular belief that water drains clockwise in the Northern Hemisphere and counterclockwise in the Southern, the Coriolis effect, is real but widely misunderstood. The effect exists but is far too weak to consistently determine the direction of a household drain. And yet the myth persists specifically because we have been so trained to think that clockwise is the natural direction of the Northern Hemisphere that we project it onto phenomena that don't actually follow the rule. Sports tracks. Most athletic running tracks are run counterclockwise, not because it is more natural, though some evidence suggests left turning feels more efficient for right-handed people, but because the convention for running tracks was established in the 19th century, following the convention of horse racing in Britain, which ran counterclockwise to give right-handed jockeys better control of their whip. The direction of time, as encoded by a Northern Hemisphere shadow, has, over 3,500 years, quietly structured the direction of screws, the turning of wheels, the running of athletes, and the flow of global commerce. All from a stick in Egyptian sand. All because of where that stick was planted. The next time you check the time, and watch those hands sweep right, the way they always have, the way they always will, remember what you are actually watching. You are watching the shadow of a stick planted in Egyptian sand 3,500 years ago, moving in the direction it moved because of the latitude of the Nile. Copied by Greek sundials, copied by Roman sundials, copied by medieval European clockmakers, standardized by British imperial power, and now running, unremarked and unquestioned, in every home, every phone, every wrist on Earth. The direction of time is not physics. It is not mathematics. It is not the universe. It is geography. It is history. It is the accumulated weight of decisions made by people who never considered that half the world experienced the sun from a completely different angle. And it is completely invisible. Until now. On this channel we find the things you have looked at every day without seeing them, and we show you what is actually there. Yesterday we looked at the human teeth inside the most famous portrait in American history. Next, we are going inside the homes of Victorian Britain, into a product that sat on the walls of millions of ordinary houses. That was making families sick, that manufacturers knew was dangerous, that the government knew was dangerous, and that stayed on those walls for decades because the people dying from it were not the people with the power to stop it, subscribe, because that one is closer to home than you think.